G'day, my name's Steve Weyland and welcome to Two Blokes and a Motorbike. This show's about two mates restoring classic motorcycles from the 70s, the 80s, right up to the late 90s. One bike at a time, because quite frankly, we're easily confused. We've got a lot of experience to draw on, so hopefully you'll come along for the ride and we'll keep it entertaining.
Two Blokes and a Motorbike is brought to you by bikereview.com.au.
Welcome to our third episode. On the show so far, the bike's upright, the back end's together, and the forks are assembled. This episode we'll get the front end on and the front wheel in. We'll mount the fairing bracket, the headlight, the gauges, and maybe even the chain and sprockets. Now that's a lot of work, so let's get into it. Right, let's get the front end in. Mike has fitted a new lower bearing to the triple clamp, or triple tree if you prefer, and gives it a dab of grease.
Starting to come out the bottom, what we want. No smart ass comment?
No, no, not at all. What comes out your bottom doesn't interest me at all.
Ah, good.
But if it's grease, I'll be seeing a doctor.
Too much time in the workshop for you, my friend.
Mike then applies even more grease to the bearing race in the bottom of the steering head tube. Then he goes to town on the top bearing, and you know what he's going to say next.
More grease. Alright.
You finished?
Nearly. Okay. Now we grease up the top race. In there.
Everything's well and truly greased by now, folks.
We don't want any dust or moisture getting in there, because that kills bearings. They can sit there like it should. This goes up into the head stem and
out through the bearing. I think you'll all agree that all that was missing there was some Barry White music.
now this goes on top.
It does.
So
That goes on that way.
Goes on that way.
No washer?
No, I'm a cleaner. Go by best feel. That goes on there.
Shiny new.
Second hand but good bolt. Goes on there. Again, just doing it finger tight because everything's got to be adjusted. So that's the front triple tree all fitted.
And after we throw in the clamp bolts, it's time to fit the forks. Here we go. Alright. Line them up. What's critical, folks, is that you have this distance, this measurement must be exactly the same either side. It's not as critical how high, but certainly they've got to be the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Now Mike tightens up the clamps, fits the other leg, and does the same. And once again, Mike throws himself into harm's way. We'll be back in a moment to see if he survives. I'm dreaming about riding this thing already. But back in the real world, we'll attack the front wheel. Now we've had the tyres and tubes professionally fitted. Even the wheel bearings are new. No, we didn't fit the tyres and tubes because we want them to stay inflated. But what we can do confidently are the brakes.
The discs are rotational. There is a left and there is a right. And the speedo drive on these bikes is on the left hand side. So that means that disc goes on that side and that disc
And
that side.
you can see by the speed holes, this is ventilation, folks, ventilated discs. They first started doing this in the, well, it would have been the early 80s, I guess, when they first started doing it, to give more surface area to a disc and make it, well, in theory, it cools a lot better. These days, a lot of discs have got waves and they've got lots and lots of drill holes in them for the same reason. But they're much thinner these days and much lighter, and they're generally a floating disc. These are a solid old disc, and not exactly lightweight, but then neither are we. Okay, locate that in the right side of the wheel over the bolt hole. After fitting one side, we thought we'd better show you how we fit the other. It's basically the same process as the rear sprocket and the rear disc. Lock washers, bolts with a little thread locking goop, tighten, torque, and lock the washer tabs. Now Mike fits the speedo drive, or does he?
Yeah, it's not even...
No. Just another hiccup you'll encounter when restoring a bike. So, after we establish that it's the correct drive unit for this model bike, Mike pulls it apart to see where the problem lies. Well, as it turns out, this plate was bent and the two tangs weren't connecting with the front wheel. So Mike reassembles the unit after straightening things up, and after refitting it, we can temporarily get this wheel back in the bike. Time to celebrate! The bike finally goes on the bench. I'm sick of grovelling around on a concrete floor, and no doubt you're sick of seeing up Mike's shorts. As the editor, and because it's a family show, I've wasted too much time blurring out testicles. Not that it was as big a job as it could have been. Okay, moving on. So we've bolted on the handlebars to steer it and tie it down to the bench. While someone tidies up their tools in the background, I'll try and get a word in. Mike's not familiar with the term quiet on set. Anyway, today we're going to attempt to throw the front fairing bracket on, which supports the front fairing, the headlight, the indicators and the screen, of course. Once we've fitted that, we will move on and try and fit the tail light assembly to the back. We've still got to do a lot of things yet. We've got to put a wiring loom on, brakes, bodywork, the list goes on. Then after securely clamping the front wheel, we can remove the straps and start fitting the stuff on the front. The eagle-eyed among you might even spot the lovely Teresa in the background, but we can't be sexist, so she's the one just behind the lovely Mike. By the way, the washed out colour you're seeing is because we're standing under the glow of Mike's skylight on his roof. It's got nothing to do with the fact that we're using a mobile phone as a second camera. First, we'll fit the top fairing bracket to the frame, then the lower section goes on. Now, in keeping with the rest of the bike, we had the fairing bracket professionally painted satin black, the same as the fork lowers and the triple clamps, so they all match. And once again, folks, it's an easier job with two people. It saves a lot of scratching, frustration, swearing. Not that you won't get that anyway. And the fairing bracket is all bolted into place. Now Mike fits some new rubber grommets to the headlight mounts, and on it goes. Although you can get aftermarket headlights to suit Katanas that are much stronger, we've decided to stick to the original unit just to look that bit more authentic. Now the original one is about as bright as, well, Mike. But the standard lights are good enough around town. If the next owner decides to head off to an overnight rally in the country, they might want to beef them up a bit.
That should be tight already. Yep, so...
Does it look square? Is it horizontal?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Mike's happy, I'm happy, and after seeking a third opinion, we move on to the next job. And that next job is the battery box, which, surprise, surprise, is a box that holds the battery. And while it's pretty much out of sight on the finished bike, we've still bead blasted and repainted it, because it'd be silly not to.
Ready for a battery? Soon.
When we get one.
When we get one.
When we can afford one. Let's talk about the gauges, or instrument cluster if you prefer.
brand spankers. Well, good enough anyway. Good enough to brand new. When you look at the old ones, they're lovely. All
right. Each bike we do, we keep the original mileage. There's no point going back to zero. It's not like we've rebuilt the motors and we're starting again. We just do what we have to with the motors to make them run extremely well and have everything they should. But rewinding mileage or resetting things to zero is just a pointless exercise, I think. Bikes of this age really aren't sold on their kilometres. They're beyond that. And frankly, you can never tell if it's genuine mileage or those gauges were the right ones on the bike in the first place. So leave them as they are. As long as they work, make sure they work. I believe the only time a vehicle should have zero on the odometer is when it's brand new or unused. Otherwise, you're just kidding yourself. It's a bit like getting too much cosmetic surgery in your 50s. You might think you're starting afresh, but the rest of the world can see how many Ks are already on the clock. Okay, this is the speedo unit for a Katana. They have a rather unique all-in-one unit. It's a one-piece unit. Now, what we find on a lot of Katanas is this fascia on the front gets badly faded. Needles tend to break, common thing. Obviously the globes start to go and a lot of your indicators there aren't showing you what's going on. This little bezel around the outside, thank you Mike, quite often gets discoloured over the years and very often dented and scratched. And there's a sealing rubber there which keeps the water out of the unit when you seal it all together. This internal case of the unit quite often can be broken. This is a good one. This is the speedo drive gear. So your speedo cable comes up through the gauges, winds onto there, it drives a gear in here, which in turn gives you your speedo reading. The tacho is driven electronically on a Katana, there's no cable. There's your electronics there, your block that gets a plug in it. Off your wiring loom. These are all your individual globes, which just pull out and you can replace those quite easily once you've got the back cover off the gauges. Now this cover comes in the back, covers all of that stuff, is screwed in place and it sits on the bike on a bracket. Here is your bracket. The bracket goes inside there and it mounts that to the motorcycle. This particular bracket has little rubber grommets that just slip on there. Obviously Mike's repainted this to make it look nice and new. Just take that back off. Now bear in mind folks, you can buy these separately from Suzuki. You can buy this whole unit from Suzuki, but you can't buy most of the parts. For example, the needles, the glass, the bezel don't come separately. So you've got to hunt them down or find good ones or find a man who can do all of this work for you, which is what we've done. A chap in Victoria who does a lot of these gauges, he's very, very good at it. He's not cheap, but why would he be when he's good at it? Folks, don't be afraid to spend the money if it's a good job. And frankly, he does a very good job. So firstly, what we have to do is mount this to the gauges, then put the cover on, then we can mount it to the bike. After 8 cups of coffee, Mike sets about reassembling the back of the instrument cluster. This is his normal working speed, by the way. Like Bruce Lee, we've had to slow him down during the rest of the show just so viewers can follow what he's actually doing. So, he fits the bracket, the outer cover, and finally pushes on the odometer knob. Now we bolt the bracket up under the top triple clamp. The bolts go through rubber cushions, which help reduce vibration in the gauges. And job done. This is a Katana front disc. And I know I called it a ventilated disc earlier, but it's actually a drill disc. So before you all start running off and writing letters, not that people like picking on my mistakes. This is an actual ventilated disc. It's also designed to dissipate heat, but it's off a car. These weigh about 5 times as much as one of these. The other thing, they're not out in the cool flowing air like a motorcycle disc, so they need all the help they can get. Honda tried these on a couple of bikes back in the 80s. They even enclosed a few of the discs. The Honda MVX 252-stroke triple springs to mind. But since it was a hand grenade of the highest order, the brakes were the least of its worries. So, if you're looking at a used bike, remember, unless you're a speedway rider, brakes are fairly important. So let's go back to our trusty little GPX 600 and we'll give you some more tips on what to beware of. First, let's start with the rear brake. See if you can look through the caliper from this angle, and you'll see how much meat is left on the pads. If they're dragging on the disc, the caliper may need attention. Or if they're squealing, the pads might be totally worn out. If the bike has a centre stand, you can fairly easily check the operation of the rear brake, and there shouldn't be too much pedal needed to get them to lock up. As for the disc, you're looking for any major grooves. If they're only minor, like on an LP record, they're fine. But if the edge of it has a lip like Mick Jagger, you'll probably have to replace it. And if you happen to have any LPs by Mick Jagger, you're probably as old as I am. Also, have a quick look over the brake lines for any leaks, or wet areas around master cylinders, as they all need to be fluid tight. It's also fairly crucial that you check the front master cylinder for leaks. Evidence of weeping around the cap is not unusual on an older bike, but any larger leakage will damage any paintwork it touches on the tank or fairing. And do give the front brake lever a squeeze or two. It should have a smooth action without coming all the way into the handlebar. And you should also check the front hoses and junctions for any leaks, all the way down to the calipers. Unlike the Katana's anti-dive system, which, as we mentioned, is about as useful as a Bachelor of Arts degree, the one on this bike is electronically controlled. But you may find fork oil down there, so it pays to have a look. Well, it's a new day back in the workshop. One thing we shouldn't overlook is the bike's electrical system. For example, the wiring loom that came with the bike had more dodgy connections than Prince Andrew. Fortunately, Mike dabbles in the black arts, and by testing and replacing any faulty plugs, along with retaping and fitting it along the frame, he managed to save the day. No, I didn't film it because drinking beer is far less boring. Just take my word for it, it's on the bike and it works. Hopefully.
Today we're going to put on the front sprocket. This is a brand new one, and it's a bit different to the standard sprockets that came with these bikes. This is a standard sprocket, and it's a 630 pitch, and it's got a cush drive front and back. Now the cush drive they put on them to soak up vibration and noise back in the day. You just can't get these sprockets anymore. So we're going for a same size sprocket externally, but they're a different pitch. This is a 530 pitch, and that's the old 630. So we don't need that. But because we're going with this new one, it doesn't have a cush drive. We've got to put a spacer on there, like that. So it makes up the difference of the cush drive sprocket. Now, the 630 chains rob this thing of a lot of horsepower as well. They really are quite heavy and awkward. So putting a 530 chain on these is a better option. They're much less robbing of horsepower, and they don't have a lot to start with. So we'll put on the sprocket first, then the spacer goes on, then the lock washer goes on. I didn't get a new one, I probably should have, but it's not going to make much difference, you can't see it. So the lock washer's on there, and then there's your front sprocket nut. Goes right up, and just finger tight for the moment, because we can't tighten it up until we get a chain on there to stop it from moving.
Now, every bike has a standard gear pattern in the gearbox, which you can't change easily unless you're going to go racing and you want to get really serious. However, what you can do is change the external gearing by changing the sprocket sizes. And the most logical thing to do is to go smaller on the rear or larger on the front if you're going to change your gearing. If you go larger on the rear, you'll find that your chain is probably too small. You'll have to get a longer chain. It's easier to make a chain shorter than it is to lengthen it. So, this is the right size sprocket for this bike. So I think we worked out a 49 tooth on the back, but a 17 tooth on the front. If I wanted more acceleration and less top end speed, I could simply reduce the size of the front sprocket. The only problem with that is if you go too small on the front sprocket, you're creating too sharp an angle for the chain to travel around and it wears your chain out faster. So, the other option is to go bigger on the rear, but of course, as I said, that means you need to get a longer chain. If you want to go the other way and you want to reduce your acceleration and give you more top end speed, you reduce the size of the rear sprocket. Or you can go larger on the front, but again, you're limited by the amount of room you've got under the sprocket cover itself, and you don't want to start rubbing your engine cases with the chain. So you've got to make a decision. You can look into gearing. There's optional gearing for almost every bike out there. You can buy different size sprockets. Just make sure you don't jump too far. And just remember, 3 teeth on the back is about equivalent of 1 on the front, roughly. It's about 2.5 on the back to 1 on the front. So you will notice it just with a simple 1/2 change on the front sprocket. You will notice a difference in your gearing. I suggest, especially on something of this age, stick to the standard gearing. If you want to change it later on, you can, but I would always start with the standard gearing, so you've got a baseline. But we've kept with the standard one on this one, and I think it's obviously what the factory recommended. Unless you're going to go to the drag strip, leave it alone.
Right, let's get this chain on. So we'll feed him through.
This chain may look like some of the links are kinked, but that's only because they're packed with a lot of grease when brand new. If a used chain has kinks like this, it's a bin job. We've already cut this chain to length and then joined it up with the split length supplied in the pack. Okay, we forgot to film this bit, so here's us joining a chain on another Katana. The supplied joining link goes in from the back. The supplied grease and the O-rings are next. Then the front plate is fitted. For whatever reason, Mike only has this ridiculously oversized G-clamp, which we use to press on the plate. Then the retainer clip goes on with the round end facing the direction of travel so it can't catch on anything and flick off. That's it. Job done. And like most of the assembly process, we've loosely adjusted up the chain, knowing that we'll have to double check it later. Alright, we're going to tighten up the nut on the front sprocket. Now, ideally you don't put it into gear and rely on the gearbox to hold the shaft, because you're just putting undue stress on your gearbox and doing damage. So when you tighten this up, all you need to do, because the leverage you've now got with the chain through the back wheel, if we lock this back wheel in place, that's all we need. It's tried and tested by the ancient Egyptians and shit. First, with a carpet offcut to protect the swing arm, Mike fits a bar through the wheel which locks it still. Then he torques up the front sprocket nut. I'm just holding the wheel to make sure this bar across the bottom doesn't fall out of place. After he's finished grunting and groaning, Mike then folds the lock washer over onto the nut with a hammer and drift.
Alright, have a look at that, see if you're happy.
Oh, I'm happy. Looks like it's been chewed by a bear. But it's going to do the job. It's flattened over that nut, which means it's impossible for that nut to undo itself, which is really what you want to be assured of when you're riding this motorcycle. And speaking of things good, this chain is an O-ring chain. It has O-rings between each link, each plate, which retains the lubrication on the chain, keeps out any moisture and dust. Well, not mostly. But the fact is it's a better quality chain than a non-O-ring chain, and on a bike of this standard, you really want to put something decent on there, make sure it's going to last, and don't try and cheap out on everything you buy. It's not always a good move. Cheap chains tend to stretch very quickly too, and they just damage your sprockets and you're back to square one again. So go with something a little bit better. Just a couple of quick emails. Rodney writes in, I don't understand why you're always making fun of Mike. How ridiculous. You've seen him, why wouldn't I? Seriously though, Mike's a big boy. Trust me, he can take it. And he gives as good as he gets. We just can't air everything that Mike says because it's not always... He's not politically correct or as sensitive or diplomatic like I am. But thanks for your concern, Rodney. Dickhead. And we've got a letter from Mike. If I hear you say the word anywho one more time, I'm going to stuff you under the workbench and lower it. So, just to recap, the front wheel is ready and the forks go in. We fit the wheel and up in the air it all goes. Now the headlight and gauges are in place and finally the chain goes on the sprockets. This bike is well on the way. So in the next episode, on go the brakes and they get a right bleeding. Then, in a surprising move, we move. And absolutely everything must go. So join us as we say goodbye to the old shed and head off to a brand new location, where we'll see Mike dabble in the mysteries of carburettor building. And maybe if the gods are with us, we'll get to fit them on the bike. I've been Steve Weyland.
And I've been Mike Tucker.
We'll see you next time.
Two Blokes and a Motorbike is brought to you by bikereview.com.au.